Well, we're joined now by Rachel SHABI, who's a journalist specialising in the Middle East. And Rachel, I know you've been talking to people in Cairo this morning. What are their concerns?
Well, everybody's really worried about a showdown that's evolving today, with the Muslim Brotherhood on one hand determined to put its people on the streets, a day of anger to protest against the escalating bloodshed that we've seen on the streets in the past few days. And meanwhile, the Egyptian government, the transitional government, authorising the army and the security forces to use live ammunition. So it looks like there's a showdown between these two very large forces in Egypt, the army and the Muslim Brotherhood, and they both seem like they want to fight it to the end.
The impression is that neither side is particularly susceptible to pressure from the outside world. We've obviously heard from the Americans, the shape of Barack Obama's statement yesterday. We've heard from the UN Security Council overnight.
I mean, the US is in a very difficult position. I mean, obviously, a few weeks ago we heard the Secretary of State, John Kerry, effectively say that it wasn't a coup that took place in Egypt, that the army was, as he put it, restoring democracy. So it's obviously lost a lot of credibility now, when the logical conclusion of any military coup is the kind of violence that we've seen on the streets of Egypt today, and in the past few days, the worst violence that Egypt has seen for decades. So it's almost as though the US has inadvertently endorsed this policy, and it's, you know, for the past 6 weeks been saying, well, we can't call it a coup, but we're not saying it's not a coup either. And of course it looks like it's really more concerned about its own interests in the region, which are to do with stability, maintaining the Egyptian agreement with Israel, the 79 peace accords, giving the US Army effectively, the US Navy effectively, a right of way in the Suez Canal. It looks as though the US is more concerned about those issues rather than the well-being of the Egyptians on the streets.
And meanwhile, one can only imagine that the Egyptian army and police, the security forces, they need to keep one eye on what Washington is saying, because they do rely heavily on aid. But at the same time, they're sounding quite defiant this morning.
Well, they do and they don't need to keep an eye on it. I mean, on the one hand, as you say, they get $1.3 billion in aid a year, but it's not as though the Obama administration has said, well, if you don't stop the violence, there will be penalties and consequences to do with that aid. And even if it did say that, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates have already pledged way more than that sum of money to Egypt. So it's almost as though the army doesn't really need to pay attention to anybody outside of Egypt at the moment.
And then paying attention to anyone inside of Egypt, there presumably is a large swathe of public opinion which is neither directly in the army camp nor directly in the Brotherhood camp, who both sides would like to sway.
We're not hearing an awful lot from that body of people. That's the problem. We're seeing overwhelming support amongst the opposition for the army's very violent and bloody dispersal of the Muslim Brotherhood protests. We're starting to see very small glimmers of a kind of third way. The Revolutionary Youth Movement in Egypt, the April 6th movement, which of course was germinal to the 2011 revolution that removed Hosni Mubarak, and the Salafis, they're also condemning the violence. So we are starting to see people say that this is completely unacceptable and only a political negotiated solution will bring this bloodshed to an end. But sadly, those voices are not nearly loud enough at the moment.
Rachel, many thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
And a reminder, much more on the situation in Egypt, including Q&A on events that led to President Morsi's ousting from power. All of that on the website, the address, as you can see there.